There is this report, fairly short report by the Chatham House and the Institute for Public Policy Research, both from the UK, which put out a fairly alarming message. 1.5 degrees C, dead or alive? The risk to transformational change from reaching and breaching the Paris Agreement goals. So the idea is that the 1.5 degrees C goal should be so sacrosanct that we should try to reach it dead or alive, however you want to interpret it. The basic idea is that the catastrophes, multiple risks, cascading risks, so-called polycrisis, where multiple crises come together and the resulting risk is larger than each event separately, and whether that will be reached if we hit 1.5 degrees C, because that could mean that we will spend all the money just addressing the risks rather than focusing on the transformational change that is needed to get out of this loop. So that's the idea. Let's read a few words and then look at a few figures. The historical failure to sufficiently tackle the climate and ecological crisis could create consequences that challenge the ability of societies to tackle the root causes of this crisis, like decarbonizing net zero. The vast changes needed to limit global heating and restore nature must be achieved in ever shorter periods of time. Continued investments in fossil fuels create more vested interests who oppose change. Meanwhile, societies are being called upon to respond to the relentless damaging symptoms of the crisis. These challenges could increasingly distract from efforts to realize rapid decarbonization and nature restoration. Already there is an IEA report out showing that the fossil fuel subsidies jumped over 2021 when we went into 2022 because of the various factors like the recovery from COVID, collapse of the economies, Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and so on. So this is called a doom loop here. The consequences of the crisis and the failure to address it draw focus and resources from tackling its causes, leading to higher temperatures and ecological loss, which then create more severe consequences, diverting even more attention and resources, and so on. So that's the doom loop you don't want to get into. We describe this as a strategic risk to our collective ability to realize a transformation of societies that ultimately avoids catastrophic climate and ecological change. Just to be sure, 1.5 degrees C goal and the 2 degrees C goal evolved in a kind of a convoluted way, and there has been some efforts to retrofit the impacts of crossing these targets, so not everybody is bought into them as a total scientific limit. And there is also this idea of accumulated carbon leading to additional warming, so then you can estimate how much carbon is left to be emitted by looking at how much we have already emitted to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees C, and looking at the current emission rates per year, figuring out how many years are left. So this is also not something social scientists consider a good idea, to say we have only 7 years left to save ourselves and from catastrophic and climate and ecological change and so on. So these words are descriptors like catastrophic are to be used carefully, so one has to make their own decision on how to go from climate change that is happening, extremes that are resulting from those, the impacts that are happening, to deciding how quickly to do things. So I'm not trying to say we should delay action, but I'm just saying that there are uncertainties about projections into the future which we have to worry about in pushing very strongly for action in one direction or the other. The report proposes responses across 3 areas: politics, better anticipating and responding to narratives that favor delaying or blocking transformational change as temperatures approach 1.5 degrees C, as part of a wider process of developing environmental narratives befitting the deepening challenges of the crisis. So it's generally argued that when people say 1.5 degrees C is not that dangerous, or that we are bound to exceed it, there is no way we will stay under it. This report interprets, and there are others who interpret, that this is a way to delay action or emissions reductions. That's not what I am intending to say anyways. Policy, decisively shifting beyond an incrementalist policy-making mindset and placing policies that can realize a system-wide transformation at the heart of advocacy. Analysis, improving policy relevant analysis and accessible communication of complex risks resulting from the deepening climate and ecological crisis. So the idea, I would say, is we don't really have the solutions. As this report itself points out, we are relying on net zero negative emission technologies, decarbonization with bioenergy, carbon capture, which are technological promises that are not guaranteed to be realized in time, and yet they are pushing for this decarbonization. So deep and immediate emissions reductions are needed to put the world on a track to meet the Paris goals. This is a true statement, but how quickly and how can we do it is not always obvious. Annual carbon emissions to align. There is a bit of a breeze here which may make some noise in the recording. I'll see how bad it is. I live without an AC, so I leave the windows open and I get breeze. Okay, that's climate change. Annual carbon emissions to align with the IPCC AR6 mitigation pathways to keep emissions within remaining carbon budgets for 1.5 degrees C. So that amounts to 380 gigatons CO2 by looking at cumulative carbon. 1.7 degrees C gives us 730 gigatons CO2, and 2 degrees C allows us 1230 gigatons CO2 by 2100 with certain probabilities like 66%. So if we put that in the context of gigaton CO2 emissions per year, look at the historical emissions with the COVID dip here, the financial crisis and so on, and look at where we need to be in terms of drawdowns for the 1.5 degrees C, 380 gigaton CO2, we need to hit zero by 2040 with 1.7 degrees C, 730 gigaton CO2, we need to hit net zero by 2055 or so, and 2 degrees C and 1230 will take us beyond 2080. Okay, goals, but we're not sure how we will get there. This is another way to portray it. The promise of negative emissions and solar radiation modification technologies might be used as a substitute for deep emissions reductions achieved through transformative changes to societies. So assuming that we'll get carbon capture working and we'll do solar radiation management to tide over the peak exceedances and so on, ignore the uncertainties and the dangers even associated with these, and can be used as an excuse to delay deep emissions reductions. We are in what is called a carbon trap, on which I have a separate podcast you can look up, but that's because we don't have solutions. If you want to really live a net zero carbon lifestyle right now, can you really do it? Everything we do emits carbon, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So let's look at risk on this axis and time here as a schematic. So let's say there is a threshold where the dangers posed by environmental tipping points and cascading and systemic shocks might push the overall risk faced by societies beyond a manageable level of risk or manageable threshold. And if you stay on business as usual, you go into very high risk region, then emissions reductions would bring you down here, where assuming less transformational change means fewer emissions reductions and therefore a greater requirement for negative emissions, which might not be possible and come with high costs and risks. So these are technological promises that are not really guaranteed to be met. Then you have solar radiation modification, which will give us a way to go from that level here to negative emissions and solar radiation management to bring you below the threshold. So greater adaptation might improve the manageability of the dangers faced by societies. And assuming possibilities of solar radiation management or modulation allows for further risk reduction without deep emissions cuts, but these assumptions are highly speculative and risky. For example, even if we end up going after solar radiation modification by putting aerosols into the stratosphere or at this Lagrange point as recently proposed by another paper, remember that the CO2 will continue to build unless we reduce emissions while solar radiation is being reduced by aerosols, which means acidification and so on will go on. And when the aerosols are washed out or the spraying is stopped, then there will be a rebound warming. So these are kind of dangerous ways to think about managing future trajectories of warming. How societies react to the worsening consequences of the climate and ecological crisis could enhance or erode collective agency to deliver transformational change. Agency is basically the ability and the willingness to do things. So we have agency in doing things to the extent that individuals or collectively we can make choices. This stylized diagram of the relationship between the effects of climate and ecological crisis and the ability of societies to collectively address its root causes basically looks at the ability to manage strategic risk, determines whether the worsening effects of the crisis undermine or enhance action. So that could decrease or increase the realization of rapid emissions reductions and ecological regeneration, which impacts the level of global heating and destabilization of other natural systems, because they're all intimately coupled and connected with feedbacks, and that would increase the environmental shocks, which then would increase complex cascading systemic risks to societies, and that the effect of these cascading systemic risks to societies whose effects would challenge the collective focus on and ability to deliver transformational societal change. So this is kind of the doom loop that has positive and negative feedbacks which we have to manage overall. Okay. They provide an analogy here where there is a ship which has spotted a storm, and the storm represents the climate and ecological crisis and its risks. Of course, the challenge is for environmentalists to look at this storm and convince the crew, which represents the decision makers as well as the society, which has to participate in the socio-technical transformations to bring about change. The crew has to be convinced of that the storm exists and it's a risk, and the ship has to change course and prepare for contingencies of the worsening weather as we get closer to the storm. So you will need policy change, reduce emissions, regenerate nature, adopt societies to inevitable impacts. So the course was not sufficiently changed, and the ship and its crew are now in the storm and heading deeper into it, experiencing the bad weather that is being brought by the storm itself. So the first challenge remains to get away from the storm, but this imperative is joined by another challenge, the need to manage the impacts of the storm on the ship and its crew, analogous to the worsening shocks and complex systemic risks that the climate and ecological crisis is increasingly bringing. Crucially, this could undermine capability to steer away from the storm. So you go so close to the storm, weather is so controlled by the storm that now you don't have a control of the ship itself. That is, the ability to achieve transformational change in societies across the world that realize rapid emissions reductions and regeneration of nature. Societies could become increasingly bound up or even overwhelmed by the symptoms of the crisis, undermining action on the root causes, which is our energy-intensive lifestyle, right? The risks to achieving transformational change resulting from the growing likelihood of breaching the 1.5 degrees C target could be seen as a special case of this general situation. A worst-case scenario is that these dynamics push the global emissions reductions and nature regeneration below a critical threshold needed to avoid cascading environmental change. So the idea of tipping points is used here. Again, not everybody is bought into that concept because they are so-called black swan events or whatever are not easy to predict. They exist theoretically in the system. Putatively they could occur. What are the exact triggers that bring them about beyond the tipping point, and when that may happen remains highly uncertain. So how to prepare them for them, or how to allocate resources for them, is not obvious. So we still have to worry about mitigation and adaptation and transformational change anyways. Okay. So finally, a challenging conversation is sorely needed on the issues of these strategic risks. The growing recognition that the world's many crises are interrelated and deepening, amounting to a state of polycrisis, which is the idea of multiple crises coming together and the sum of the risks being greater than the parts. This provides an opportunity to do so. This conversation cannot be held purely in private. The ability of societies to deliver transformational change as the climate and ecological crisis deepens and its effects spill across the world will be a function of cooperation. Effort is needed to help populations to face up to and prepare for the magnitude of the challenges to come. One particular need is to help younger generations who will bear the greater brunt of strategic risk over careers that extend to and beyond 2050, when global goals should be met. This is the focus of the Cohort 2040 project, which will be releasing more discussion papers to explore how to respond to strategic risks. These generations will soon be called upon to navigate in the throes of a deepening storm. Of course, we are colonizing the future either way, by doing something or not doing something. So this means the approach of making the message more and more alarmist and saying end justifies the means may not be the best way to navigate into the future either, or navigate the deepening storm either. Okay, so big challenge, but you have to also basically worry for yourself how you are going to play a role in this, depending on your age, how you see the risk yourself, and what you think are the solutions to decarbonizing and getting out of this carbon trap. Okay.